Good morning. We've got some sort of awkward, weird polling system we've set up that will hopefully allow you to indicate to me and to the people behind the stage there what questions you're most interested in asking. And because I didn't have to practice this and there's no one who's controlling what I say or what my timing is, some of my questions will be short, succinct, and to the point, and some of them will be long and drawn out, and no one gets to pick except me. So I'm looking forward to this. I think they're going to start showing you questions any second now. And the idea is you're going to text some number they give you with the questions that you are most interested in answering, in me answering, rather. And I can't see them down here right now, so let's see. Why don't I start with one I want to answer, which is, will we share lessons learned from the AWS scalability exercise with the community? We certainly should. So we went through this exercise where we were trying to get as many machines as possible running on our infrastructure on AWS. And there we go. Now I can see them. And most of the goal was, hey, when do things begin to fall over? Because everything falls over at some point with a certain load. And it's actually relatively complicated to fabricate loads effectively in terms of, do you actually want to turn on 2,000 real machines? Do you want to, you saw the demo that Chris did yesterday. He was able to replicate the load of a certain number of machines, and he did that through tools that record HTTP traffic and things like that. So we basically got up to about 2,000 machines on Amazon, and we're using that to hit a server and figuring out what parts of the system still worked, what parts of the system fell over. Most of the work was built around, it was mostly targeted at mCollective and some of the core Puppet stuff, but then also taking a bunch of the other components of Puppet Enterprise and testing those too. I don't know if we specifically have plans right now, but we certainly should. The person who did all the work, Brett, I will talk to him about whether I can get him to write up a blog post on that, because I think it should be pretty interesting. Let's see. Can we talk more about plans for the Puppet Apps program? How many and when? I would be surprised if we ever released more than one a quarter, and I would also be surprised if we added that many that quickly. Not that many meaning, a specific amount, but the thing that I want to make sure we do with the apps is that we focus on iterating on them specifically. So rather than, say, putting out 20 of them, I'd rather put out 4 and then put out 5 releases of each of them in the same amount of time. We're still a relatively small company. We still have to be relatively circumspect in what we attempt to commit to do. And so we're going to try pretty hard to make real progress on the areas that matter most, but we're also going to try pretty hard not to get overextended in terms of having too many applications, or really crucially, having so many applications that we can't update them regularly. We can't evolve them as quickly as I think they need to be evolved in order to be successful. Any other questions? There we go. What are differences that I see between enterprise and open source in the future? So my goal with Puppet Enterprise is that it does not, I don't want it to look like, yeah, things that ain't going to happen, me doing poetry on stage. You can want that one all you want. Maybe when I have a couple of drinks, but not yet. So Puppet Enterprise versus open source. I want Puppet Enterprise to consist of technology built on top of open source. I don't want it to feel like you have to choose between open source or commercial. I don't want it to feel like there is there's no difference between you don't ask the difference between like the engine of the car and the car. The engine is a critical part of the car, but the car is the car. And I want to both change how we build the technology and also how we kind of talk and communicate about it, because I think it is important to be in a place where my priority has always been to be a software company. My priority for Puppet Labs has always been I want to build great software. I want to hire engineers so I can pay them to build great software. I want to have sales and marketing people, and I need the marketing people because it turns out telling stories to the market as a means of convincing the market to use new tools, to adopt new concepts and technology, it's an important part of the work. I need salespeople to help convince these people to use technology. And as much as technical people like to think that salespeople and marketing are just overhead, they're a really important part of getting technology adopted widely. And it turns out that all these things require some level of income on our part. And even the open source software, we fund the vast, vast majority of that open source software. So my goal was always to build a company that was able to sell software and use that sales to pay all my employees. But at the same time, there are a lot of great reasons to have open source. Open source is a critical part of that terraforming I talked about yesterday. We're really trying to change how the market works, change how the market thinks. That terraforming is done much better with open source software. It's done much better with software that can run absolutely everywhere than with trying to draw lines around, well, you have to pay for this and you have to do that. So the challenge for me was always, how do I make sure that we have fantastic open source software, that no part of our business model compromises the quality of our open source? And we've seen companies whose open source business model is something along the lines of, the shitty stuff is free and the good stuff costs money. We don't want that to be our business model, right? We really want to make sure that we have great open source software, and it has its own reason for existence, it has its own purpose, and it's great at that stuff. And then we have really great commercial software, and it has its own reason for existence and its own stuff. And so in the long term, what you're going to see is the commercial software and the open source software are really complementary to each other, and they're not different versions of each other. And the apps is really the first step towards being able to do that. The apps is really about, let's take the most important functions that you need to solve, let's solve them with commercial products, and let's build those on the platform built by open source. I really always thought of us as kind of an open platform company where the goal was to have a pervasive, widely used open source platform with products on top of it. I assume everyone's interested in the Docker question. No, what do I aspire to most? Oh, wow. I think this is like 2 votes. It went from, there we go. Now we've got 3 votes, 4 votes. All right, where do I feel Puppet fits into environments that do not require convergence? I think this is kind of a, let's see, how didactic do I want to be? I think that the majority of the market talks about new technology in a not very helpful way. I think too much of the market talks like, well, yesterday, every single person in the world did one thing, and tomorrow, every single person in the world will do a different thing, and we're going to make that sudden shift in some sort of square wave, and it'll be sudden and drastic, and if you don't adjust to that new entire world, then you're all dead. And 5 years ago or 3 years ago, whatever it was, everyone came to me and said, Luke, what's your OpenStack strategy? What are you going to do when the whole world is running OpenStack instead of either VMware or Amazon? And I said, well, step 1 is I'm going to wait until people run it in production, and step 2 is I'm going to believe that it's not going to take over the world right away. And I think Docker, it's a similar kind of thing where it's clearly really interesting. People are using it in a lot of cool ways, although still today almost entirely not in production. So I think we've got some time before we really understand what's going to happen. Docker is either virtualization or packaging, depending on who you talk to. And if it's packaging, then it's not nearly as sexy as people think. And if it's virtualization, then it's also not that sexy because we've been doing virtualization for a very, very long time. And I think one of the reasons why Docker is getting taken up so quickly is it's at this kind of tail end of 10 to 15 years of both heavy investment in virtualization and also that terraforming that I was talking about. It's already happened in virtualization, right? We've spent 10 to 15 years highly virtualizing our environments. As a result, it's pretty easy to switch from our previous virtualization world to this kind of containers world. But the reality is it can't be turtles all the way down, right? You can't be in a place where you only ever have entirely non-mutable infrastructure. You only ever have immutable, that's the word, not non-mutable. So at worst, I think that there will always be a role for us, just like when people ask me, so Luke, what happens when no one owns servers anymore? And my answer there is, look, no matter what happens in the future, there are going to be more servers, there are going to be more services, and they're going to be more critical. And there's going to be new, interesting, weird technology that's hard to learn and hard to use and hard to adopt. So in general, I'm not afraid that management problems go away. I'm not afraid that the problems we have today suddenly become obsolete in the space of a couple of quarters or a couple of years. So again, worst case is There's lots and lots and lots and lots of infrastructure, and some of it's Docker, and that Docker infrastructure may or may not use Puppet. Best case is, in reality, you still need something to make that Docker image look like it's supposed to look. That thing looks a lot like configuration management. Maybe that thing is part of your build pipeline uses Puppet to create that Docker image, and then when you go to build a new Docker image, then again, you run some different portion of your Puppet script to make sure that you get what you want. But even in that world, of course, you're using Puppet. You're using it in a different way, but you're still using it. You're using more of the kind of run once but not multiple times kind of model. And then our abilities to do more application management become really important. I talked yesterday just a brief amount about how we know our customers are looking for us to help them expand beyond just managing individual nodes, beyond just managing the resources in the nodes. People want to be able to talk in terms of applications. They want to be able to talk in terms of the entire infrastructure. And as we move to being able to do that, as we add tools and capabilities that allow them to do that, that allow you to do that, then it's not about Puppet per se, it's about the entire technology suite. And some of that technology suite is going to be more useful and usable and relevant in some infrastructures, and some is going to be less. So it's a long answer, but I think in general, it's going to be a while before we figure this out, like a long time. Again, remember, this is an enterprise adoption cycle, not a consumer adoption cycle. This isn't going to be as quickly as a small web startup of 4 people with no sysadmins can adopt something. You look at somebody like Bank of America or even Twitter, frankly, and they're going to take a lot longer to adopt these kind of things. And then, B, it's not going to be universal. None of these things are going to change everything. And then C, we're going to manage applications, not just individual pieces. So, are there any plans to integrate remote command execution functionality orchestration into Puppet? Orchestration is kind of my favorite word these days because I get to make up whatever I want it to mean. And everyone absolutely agrees that orchestration is critical and we should definitely add it. And then they also get to arguing about what exactly it is when they decide that they want to add it. For me, I think there's kind of, there are a few kinds of orchestration. They're all important. Some of them I think are more important than others. But the short answer is, I'm a bigger fan of trying to have small independent tools that do their jobs correctly than larger tools that have a larger surface area that try to do more things at one time. So ideally, I want to significantly improve our orchestration capabilities. I want to make us much better at the kind of 3-ish kinds of orchestration that I see out there. But I don't really want to do it by adding functionality to Puppet per se. I want to do it by adding new tools and new capabilities, most likely through, again, smaller tools. If anything, I want Puppet itself to get smaller. I want Puppet to split into a few different projects that are themselves devoted to the key functional areas of Puppet. So from my perspective, it works against that goal to add more functionality to Puppet. Now, I want to add more functionality to the Puppet ecosystem, but not Puppet the tool chain itself. And if you look at mCollective, we're doing a lot of work in mCollective right now, trying to figure out, okay, is it set up to be the baseline for that orchestration? What kind of work do we need to do? Is it going to make that transition to the world where it needs to be running everywhere? We've got a lot of performance work to do. It's based on a very powerful but relatively complicated setup platform. Is that going to scale to both the performance levels and also the maintainability levels that we need for the future? And so there's a lot of work being done on MCO right now. I wish I could give you a timeline on when we'll be able to come back and say, we know this is going to happen, we know that's going to happen, but we do know this is an important area. Again, this is an area that we're investing heavily in, and I'm personally investing heavily in. There are a couple people wandering around the halls who could tell you how much fun that is for them. Okay, questions? Again, there's only one vote on that screen, I can tell. I don't think there's no. Let's see, will there be a roadmap on Puppet's planned integration with cloud infrastructure? I think it won't surprise any of you to hear that we're not very good at roadmaps. And there are a few reasons why we're not very good at roadmaps. One of them is they're hard and they change all the time. Another one is I hate speaking in the future tense. I try as hard as I can to talk about what we are doing and what we have done rather than what we're going to do. and especially when I do roadmaps, then they change, and then I feel like I've broken promises and things like that, and it gets complicated. We are trying to get both better at roadmaps and especially better at communicating with all of you about what we think is important, what we think we should build, things like that. In terms of the both cloud infrastructures and disaster recovery, frankly, capabilities, the cloud infrastructure work is something that we're spending quite a bit of time on right now. My hope is that we'll be able to say something a little more coherently about both of those by the end of this year. I don't know whether that's be able to tell you when they're ready or whether they'll be ready. I think in some cases it'll be. I think actually we're doing some talks in the cloud infrastructure work right now. I think Ryan Coleman, he at least posted a link to a talk that I was assuming he was doing on using the Puppet DSL to do cloud infrastructure management. I think that's the direction we're mostly going to be going. And so what we have to do internally is figure out how, basically. I think that's the direction, but there's a lot of how to figure that out. So hopefully we'll hear a little more in the next quarter or so, but I would not at all take that as a promise. It's pretty similar on the recovery capabilities and recovery times. Although whoever posted that question, I'd love to hear more about that. People seem to be mostly concerned with horizontal scale out and HA and geographic distribution. I haven't heard much about disaster recovery and recovery time, so definitely interested in more detail on that. My favorite book. I read a lot, and I assume, I don't know, maybe it's not safe to assume. I was going to say I assume this is more of a workbook question versus a pleasure book question. So let's see. Probably my favorite book is Go to Lesher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. It's the hardest book I've ever read. It took me about 3 months to read. It's fair to say that I already had a mind that was relatively fond of metaprogramming and recursion, but having escaped the other end of that book alive, I was both much more skilled at it and much more fond of it. And so a lot of the metaprogramming that you see in Puppet, if you look in the code that I was responsible for in the first place, I was really comfortable with lots of self-reference. In fact, Puppet's second name before it became Puppet was Quine, which is a self-referential statement in mathematics. And the reason I liked that is because Puppet itself is kind of inherently self-referential, right? If you're managing software, one of the pieces of software you're going to obviously have to manage is the software that manages the software. So I liked that idea quite a bit. I like self-reference. I like recursion. I like the complicated parts of thinking about things. And I think Go to Lesher Bach probably covers that the most. And it's probably a great combination of both personal and work. Mostly I read an ungodly amount of business books. The great thing about business books is if you learn anything from them at all, you can pretty much put them down, because nearly every business book only has one thing to teach you. So if you've learned a thing, you're done. And if you're really lucky, it's all in the first paragraph, and the next 14 pages or chapters are all filler. Because it's not a coincidence that every business book is the exact same size and costs the exact same amount of money. This thought is worth $25, and we've written a thing that is a shape we think is worth spending $25 on. But if they gave you a pamphlet, obviously you wouldn't spend $25 in a pamphlet. You would just read it in a bookstore. So figuring out how to get the most out of business books without spending very much time on them is certainly a practice of mine. And then for, I guess pleasure is the right word, for fun, for entertainment, I mostly read nonfiction books and especially economics books. So books on economic systems or systems in general. So traffic and how money works, how money was created, things like that. I know, it's at least as exciting as it sounds. I find the challenge with any book is, so I do most of my reading between like 10:30 and midnight when I'm in bed. And the challenge with any book is you want it to be sufficiently interesting that you want to read it, but not so interesting that you read between 10:30 and 4. So you want to actually be able to go to bed that night, or go to sleep. So, okay, do we have any plans for a monitoring product? Oh, I hate this question. Let's see. There's so many great ways to go with this. So Monitorama was in Portland this year. Who was at Monitorama? Anybody? A couple people? All right. So I was pretty excited about Monitorama. Who here uses Nagios right now? Okay, so keep your hands up. No, keep your hands up. Of the ones who are using Nagios, who's pissed about it? Pretty much everybody. So similar to what I was just saying with how I think Puppet needs to be smaller, how I think tools need to be smaller, I think monitoring, one of the problems with monitoring right now is it's full of, not full of, the tools that are out there, the tools that took over, especially Nagios, it kind of tries to be a complete one-stop shop. It fails at it. It fails in, depending on what you're talking about, sometimes somewhat miserably. But that's what it's trying to do. It tries to do everything. And it's both cheap enough and pervasive enough and just good enough, or at least was just good enough 10 years ago, that it's really taken over. And it's kind of salted the fields of marketing, or monitoring. Monitoring was a vibrant industry in the early 2000s. There were good companies building interesting products. There was a lot of innovation. There was a lot of interesting stuff. There were people selling things. And Nagios pretty much came in and said, "Thou shalt not make money on monitoring software ever again." And here we are 10 years later, and it doesn't sound like that's important, but again, going back to my point, great technology is not actually enough to get technology adopted. And I have been in the audience as a technical person. I worked with somebody a long time ago, and he said, I can always tell if a technology company is going to succeed by looking at their sales and marketing. And I said, you, sir, are a jerk, and you're wrong. And I think that in a large part, it does take great sales and marketing to get technology to succeed in general. Not every time, but in general. And so if you have a space that is both incredibly important, which monitoring clearly is, and moribund, kind of dead, which monitoring at least was for a very long time, then you have to ask, what's going to cause that space to suddenly shift, right? What's going to cause it to become interesting? What's going to cause it to become what's going to cause it to become suddenly worth investing in, either as a CEO like me, as a person who's running a company and writing checks to developers, or as an investment firm or something like that? And I think the things that are necessary to make monitoring interesting are very close to being true right now. There's a lot of really interesting technology. There are a lot of people who are building tools that are compelling and different, and they're either finding ways not to compete with Nagios so that they don't have to be, they don't have to compete with that, or finding ways to compete with small parts of it and not asking you to walk in and replace an entire system. And I know the entire market doesn't use Nagios, but I think Nagios in general is kind of the reason why the market is how it is. So that's kind of what the monitoring market looks like. And I think it would be very tough today to build a great business around monitoring right now. I think there are really interesting monitoring applications. I think there are really interesting monitoring tools, and I'm really interested in it. But I think today, this minute, it would be very tough to build a business. Notice I didn't answer your question. On the other side is, how relevant is it to us, and how relevant especially is it to our customers? And I think as you get closer to application management, as you get closer to being able to talk about not the individual nodes or the individual resources or the individual kind of capabilities you're concerned about, and you start to want to worry about the application as a whole, the ways that we are able to communicate with our users, and the ways that the product and the users interact, and the way the product itself interacts across tools, it becomes a lot more monitoring-like. You end up having to have monitoring-like behaviors because, hey, I want to bring up my database server before I bring up my web server, and if the database service isn't up, then I don't want to start the web server. Okay, well, is the web server monitoring the database server, or is it just a semaphore? Or it becomes kind of awkward to even ask that kind of question, right? Because we want to have these really clear lines of what is and isn't monitoring. And I think in general what you find is those clear lines are blurring, which I think today is mostly a good thing. So I'm confident that what you'll find is, and to some extent you could argue some of the things we have today are monitoring products, right? The operations console I put up yesterday that Chris Price demoed, that's a monitoring product in some sense, right? And I know people are going to want to hook that up to PagerDuty. They're going to want to hook that up to their alerting systems and things like that. So you could argue that's monitoring, but I think we're going to get more monitoring-like in some of our areas. I can't tell you whether that's, and then we'll switch out and have a separate monitoring product, or we'll actively try to make a completely different product in addition to what we're doing today. It is an area we're going to keep watching and keep investing in. I think it's a really interesting area, and seriously, if you aren't using any of the new interesting monitoring tools like Flapjack and Flapjack's kind of, I think, for much larger organizations, but PagerDuty, I'm not going to think of any of them. Sensu. There are a lot of really interesting tools out there. There's really more development going on in that space than there has been in a really long time. Please go take advantage of it. Please stop using technology that's 15 years old and has, seriously, the CGIs are written in C, man. You got to it's just not okay. It's not okay. I have no idea. If I could be any kind of animal, what would I be? This is a relatively silly question, isn't it? I want to ask further follow-up questions. Can I make up the animal? Like, I would like to be an animal that shapeshifts into any other animal. Like, I don't know. I'd like to, yeah, I don't know. I'm not very good at answering questions like that. So, sorry about that. We'll have to go with something else. All right. My favorite one with PuppetConf so far, and I know that nobody's voted yet, none of the one or two of you who have been voting so far. I really enjoyed the party last night. So last year I was very busy at PuppetConf, and I barely made it out of the room. I was shuffling around the suite at the Fairmont like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on my feet. And I've done a lot better job of getting out of the building this time, of getting out of the kind of just meetings and out of one-on-one meetings, with many cases with customers, partners, people who are important to meet with. But I've been able to kind of walk the halls a little bit more. And the party last night was especially great. As I said in my keynote, this is a great community. People are enjoying themselves. People are having fun. They're enjoying talking to each other. They're enjoying the talks. They're enjoying the presentations. They're enjoying the demos. They're enjoying just sitting in the halls and talking. And I've always said I love the hallway tracks more than anything else. And you could see that at the party last night. You could see people talking, just having a great time, in many cases catching up because they hadn't seen each other since previous PuppetConf, or they hadn't seen each other since 3 PuppetConfs ago, but in many cases just sitting around and talking about things that they liked. And there were so many people who just came up and said hi and said thank you and said how great the event was. And it was just so many good things, and I didn't see anybody complaining. I didn't see anybody upset. I didn't see anybody who felt left out. And obviously, I didn't see everything, but I think that party really felt like a great kind of demonstration of the overall experience of PuppetConf. So that was a lot of fun for me. Also, being done with my keynote was probably a pretty good thing too. What does the process of becoming a Puppet-approved module look like? The reality is, I don't really know. And that isn't to say that we as a company don't know. There are people at this company who know. I'm just not actually one of them. I do know that we have a team of people who are working both on the Forge and on the modules who are heavily involved in that. Like, they're the ones who actually do the work. They do have a process. No small part of the process today. I mean, we don't have 500 Puppet-approved modules. We have, I think it's 12. So we're obviously starting small, and in early days like this, it's really about defining the process, figuring out what it takes to succeed, and hey, if you do this, it works. If you do that, it doesn't work. Or if you do this, then people leave and they don't want to go through a process. You don't want to have such an onerous process that nothing can get through, but you don't want to have such a lax process that anybody can get through. So right now, we're in the process of designing the process. So I actually don't know the answer to that question, but Ryan Coleman is probably the very best person to talk to about that. So track him down on the internet and harangue him mercilessly. He told me I was under no circumstances allowed to announce a new project he had to work on this year, so instead I'm just sending everyone in the community his way to ask him questions. All right, so one last quick question, and then I'm almost out of time. You got to show me questions for me to figure out what the questions are. Downstage. All right. Someone want to shout a question from the audience? No? Seriously, no one wants to yell at me? Come on. How do I name servers? Well, you got to remember, A, no one lets me do things anymore. B, no one's let me do operational things in a very long time. I actually, this might frighten all of you, but I haven't been an actual operational sysadmin since, I would say 2002. Maybe 2003, but probably more like 2002. And so back then, I actually did really have pets and not cattle. And I kind of did both. So I'm always a big fan of service IPs. So all of the service names are attached to IPs or are attached to they're either CNAMEs or things like that, and then the actual host names become irrelevant, and I never, ever, 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 ever use a real host name in anything. So I used to use, I think, almost all Norse gods and various kinds of mythological gods when I was allowed to do that. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the conference, and have a great rest of the day.